Imagine building a life so perfectly structured, only to watch it collapse in a single night. A successful career, a loyal marriage, a future meticulously planned, until one betrayal unravels it all. But what if, instead of breaking, you decided to rebuild? Stronger, smarter, and with a plan for revenge. This is the story of a man who lost everything and turned his downfall into his greatest triumph. Leonard Walsh exhaled slowly as he adjusted the knot of his tie before stepping out of the sleek, silver sedan. The evening air carried a faint chill, but it did little to cool the unease simmering beneath his composed exterior. He extended a hand to his wife, Helena, helping her out of the car. At 39, Leonard maintained the imposing stature of a man used to control. His tailored suit a testament to meticulousness, his graying temples adding a distinguished charm. Helena, 2 years younger, emerged gracefully, the deep sapphire of her gown shimmering under the golden glow of streetlights. Before them loomed the grand entrance of the annual gala for Vanguard Designs, Leonard's architectural firm. The event was the highlight of the industry's social calendar, a gathering of elite investors, corporate magnates, and celebrated designers. Yet, as they ascended the marble steps, his fingers curled slightly against Helena's arm, sensing the faint tremor in her touch. "Everything all right?" he murmured, keeping his gaze forward. She responded with a light laugh, crisp and brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. "Of course, these events always make me a little anxious." Leonard wasn't convinced. Helena had always navigated high-profile social settings with effortless charm, whether at her own gallery openings or exclusive art exhibitions. Something was different tonight. He could feel it in the way she shifted her weight, in the hesitation behind her carefully painted smile. As they entered the opulent ballroom, Leonard's eyes instinctively scanned the room, cataloging faces both familiar and new. Then, his gaze landed on someone whose presence sent a ripple of discomfort through his otherwise disciplined mind. Daniel Hart, a rising name within the firm. At 33, Daniel exuded an easy charisma that made him the center of attention. His sharp features, unassuming smile, and natural confidence had already earned him favor among key investors. But what unsettled Leonard wasn't Daniel's growing reputation. It was the way Helena's posture shifted ever so slightly when their eyes met. A subtle spark in her gaze, a tension in her shoulders. Leonard had always prided himself on his ability to read people, and the unspoken exchange between them was impossible to ignore. Throughout the evening, Leonard found himself only half listening to the conversations around him. Deals were being discussed, future collaborations hinted at, but his focus remained elsewhere, drawn repeatedly to Helena and Daniel. The laughter that lingered too long, the fleeting glances, the way her fingers lightly brushed against his arm as they spoke. A knot tightened in Leonard's chest. Midway through the night, as he stood near the bar, nursing a glass of whiskey, he overheard hushed voices from 2 junior associates not far from him. Their whispers barely carried over the clink of glasses and the soft hum of jazz music, but in a momentary lull between songs, their words became clear. "Can't believe they're being so careless," one muttered, casting a wary glance toward the far side of the room. "I know," the other sighed. "With her husband here, of all places, they must think no one notices." Leonard's grip tightened around his glass. He remained still, careful not to betray the storm brewing inside him. Slowly, he turned, his expression impassive as he approached the 2 employees. "What's being careless?" he asked casually, feigning polite curiosity. The 2 young professionals stiffened, realizing too late that they'd been overheard. The woman, a brunette with sharp eyes, stammered, "Oh, nothing, sir. Just office gossip." Leonard arched an eyebrow. "Come now, you can't leave me in suspense. What's the latest?" The man beside her looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "Really, sir, it's nothing. We shouldn't have been talking about it at all." Their discomfort only fueled Leonard's suspicion. He didn't need their confirmation. He already knew. His gaze swept across the room until he found them, Helena and Daniel, standing too close, speaking in hushed tones. The way she leaned in, the way his hand lingered just a second too long on her back. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. A dull roar filled Leonard's ears. The conversation around him faded into the background as a bitter realization settled over him. The careful touches, the intimate laughter, the nervous energy in Helena's demeanor. It all came together with sickening clarity. He exhaled, slow and controlled, forcing himself to maintain the composure that had defined his entire career. Then he set down his glass, squared his shoulders, and made his way across the ballroom. As he approached, he saw it, the fleeting flicker of guilt in Helena's expression as she caught sight of him, the momentary falter in her polished poise. Leonard stopped before them, his voice even but laced with quiet steel. "Helena," he said, "I need a word with you." She hesitated, then smiled too brightly. "Of course, darling. Is something wrong?" He didn't respond, didn't allow himself the luxury of theatrics. Instead, he turned toward the balcony doors, trusting she would follow. The night air was crisp as he stepped outside, the city skyline sprawling before him in endless lights. He heard Helena's footsteps behind him and turned to face her. Her arms were crossed, a defensive posture. "Leonard, you're scaring me. What's this about?" His eyes held hers, unwavering. "Daniel Hart," he said, his voice quiet, deliberate. "What exactly is going on between you two?" Helena's laugh came, forced and unnatural. "Leonard, that's ridiculous. He's just a colleague." He shook his head slowly. "Don't lie to me. I've seen the way you look at each other, the way you touch, the way you've been on edge all night." Her expression hardened. "You're being paranoid. And frankly, I'm offended that you'd even suggest." "Don't," Leonard interrupted, his voice now cold. "Don't insult my intelligence." The silence between them stretched, tense and unyielding. Then, as if summoned by the weight of their conversation, the balcony doors opened again. Daniel stepped outside. "Is everything okay out here?" he asked, his tone cautious, his stance subtly protective. Leonard turned toward him, his gaze sharp as a blade. "No, Daniel," he said, his voice edged with quiet fury. "Everything is not okay." Helena stiffened. Daniel shifted uneasily. And in that moment, Leonard knew without doubt, without hesitation. His world had just begun to fall apart. The air between them was thick with silence, the kind that carries the weight of unspoken truths. Leonard stood motionless, his fingers gripping the edge of the balcony railing, his mind replaying every moment of the evening, the lingering glances, the private laughter, the casual but intimate way Daniel had placed his hand on Helena's lower back. He had been blind to it before, but now the picture was painfully clear. Helena stood a few feet away, arms still crossed, her body tense. Daniel remained by the door, shifting awkwardly, as if he wanted to be anywhere but here. For a brief second, Leonard almost laughed. The younger man had confidence in the office, in meetings, in his professional domain. But here, confronted by a husband whose world had just unraveled, he was suddenly uneasy. Helena was the first to break the silence. "Leo, let's not do this here," she murmured, her voice measured but tight. A woman still trying to control a situation that had already spiraled beyond her grasp. "People are watching." Leonard turned his head slightly, catching the movement of figures through the tall glass doors of the ballroom. A few guests had paused their conversations, glancing toward the balcony, curiosity flickering in their eyes. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His private humiliation was becoming a spectacle. He exhaled sharply, straightened his tie, and nodded once. "Fine," he said, voice calm. "Let's take this somewhere private." Without waiting for her response, he stepped past Daniel, brushing against him just slightly. An act of dismissal more than aggression. He walked through the ballroom, ignoring the polite murmurs of guests, the quiet clinks of champagne glasses. His only focus was on getting out of this place, out of the stifling air of false pleasantries. Behind him, he could hear the hurried clicks of Helena's heels against the marble floor as she followed. Outside, the city's nightscape stretched before them, neon lights casting a distorted glow over wet pavement. The driver had been waiting near the entrance, the car still parked at the curb. Leonard pulled open the door, glanced at his wife. "Get in," he said. She hesitated, eyes searching his face for some clue as to what would happen next. He gave her none. She slid inside, and he followed, closing the door with deliberate force. The interior was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Leonard leaned back against the seat, staring out the window. His thoughts were sharp, slicing through years of trust, through every shared moment that had once seemed unshakable. A month ago, he wouldn't have questioned the foundation of their marriage. A week ago, he wouldn't have noticed the distance between them. But tonight had shattered any illusions he had left. Helena shifted beside him. "Leonard," she began, her voice low, almost pleading. His jaw tightened. "How long?" She hesitated. "Leo, how long?" His tone was flat, void of anger, of emotion. The breath she took was shaky. 5 months, she admitted. He closed his eyes, let the number sink in. 5 months. Nearly half a year of deceit, of stolen moments, of whispered conversations he had never been meant to hear. He felt something inside him fracture. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Helena added quickly, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress. "It just—" "Spare me," Leonard interrupted, opening his eyes again. He turned his head, finally looking at her, really looking at her. "You didn't fall into an affair, Helena. You made a choice, over and over again." She swallowed, looking down at her hands. The city lights blurred past as they drove through the streets. The weight of the conversation settled like a stone in Leonard's chest, heavier than he expected. He had spent years building a life with this woman. They had stood side by side through career triumphs and losses, through silent dinners and passionate arguments. And yet, in the end, all it had taken was 5 months to reduce everything to rubble. He wasn't sure if he was more furious at her, or at himself for not seeing it sooner. Helena finally spoke again, her voice raw. "I was lonely, Leonard." He almost laughed. "Lonely? Yes," she said, turning toward him, desperation creeping into her expression. "You were never home, always at the office, always working late. I felt like I wasn't even part of your life anymore." His fingers curled into a fist against his thigh. "So your solution was Daniel?" Her lips pressed together. "He was there." Leonard inhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain still, to not let the rage curling inside him take over. "And now what?" he asked, voice quieter, more dangerous. "Do you love him?" She didn't answer immediately. That alone was enough. Leonard turned his gaze back to the window, watching the city move past them, indifferent to his world crumbling. The silence between them stretched, heavier than before. Finally, he spoke. "I want you out of the house by the end of the week." Helena stiffened. "Leonard, you made your choice," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "And now I'm making mine." The car pulled up in front of their home. Without another word, Leonard opened the door and stepped out. He didn't look back as he walked inside, leaving Helena sitting in the car alone, the glow of the street lamp casting shadows over her face. Upstairs, in the quiet solitude of their bedroom, he loosened his tie and sank onto the edge of the bed. The events of the night replayed in his mind, looping endlessly. He had built his life around structure, around control. And tonight, everything he had known had slipped through his fingers. As he sat there in the dark, Leonard knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was only the beginning. The morning after the gala, Leonard woke up in an unfamiliar silence. The house, usually filled with the soft sounds of Helena moving through their morning routine, was eerily still. He sat up slowly, his body aching from the tension of the previous night, his mind fogged with exhaustion. She was gone. The closet was half empty. Drawers had been hastily pulled open and left ajar. A single note lay on the bedside table, the ink smudged as if she had hesitated while writing. "Leonard, I'll come by later for the rest of my things. I need time. Please don't make this harder than it already is." He read it twice, then crumpled it in his fist. His life had been dismantled in a single evening. He moved mechanically through the morning shower, suit, coffee. His body going through the motions while his mind remained a storm of questions, of accusations, of regrets. He had always been a man of control, of precision. Yet, standing in his kitchen, staring at the untouched breakfast he had made out of habit, Leonard realized how little control he actually had. By the time he arrived at the office, the whispers had already begun. Colleagues who usually greeted him with firm handshakes and confident nods now averted their gazes. Assistants lingered too long in corners, their hushed voices cutting off the moment he walked past. He ignored them, pushing forward through the sleek corridors of Vanguard Designs, his mind solely focused on his work. But focus was a fleeting thing. He sat at his desk, blueprints spread before him, calculations waiting to be refined. Yet, no matter how long he stared at the lines, the measurements, the carefully crafted projections, his mind kept drifting. His work, once his greatest escape, now felt distant, hollow. Hours passed in a haze of unproductive attempts before he finally stepped away from his desk, his frustration reaching a boiling point. He needed air. He needed space. He needed a way out of the downward spiral. That was when he ran into her. Mira Chong. He almost didn't recognize her at first. It had been years since college, since their late-night study sessions fueled by coffee and reckless ambition. Yet, standing in front of him now, she still carried the same unwavering energy, the same quiet strength that had made her stand out all those years ago. "Leonard Walsh," she said, arching a brow as she sipped from a takeaway coffee cup. "Didn't expect to see you looking like hell." He exhaled sharply, offering a humorless smile. "I could say the same for you." She studied him for a moment before tilting her head. "Walk with me." He hesitated only a second before following. They moved through the streets, the city humming around them. Mira spoke first. "So, are you going to tell me why you look like someone ran over your dog? Or should I guess?" Leonard huffed a breath. "It's complicated." Mira smirked. "Complicated is just an excuse to not say what you really mean." He shook his head, staring at the pavement as they walked. And then, maybe because he was too tired to keep it in, or maybe because Mira had always had a way of cutting through his defenses, he told her. Not in detail, not with unnecessary flourishes, just the raw truth. By the time he finished, they had reached a quiet park bench, the sounds of the city muffled by the canopy of trees. Mira leaned forward, elbows on her knees, watching him. "So, what are you going to do now?" He scoffed, running a hand down his face. "Hell if I know." She was silent for a moment before she said, "You ever tried punching something?" Leonard blinked at her. "Excuse me?" She grinned. "I run a kickboxing class. Helps clear the head. You should come by." He opened his mouth to decline, but the words never came. 'Cause, really, what else did he have? And that was how it started. At first, it was just an excuse to escape the suffocating quiet of his home, to keep his body too exhausted to think. But as the days passed, something changed. The rush of movement, the burn in his muscles, the satisfaction of hitting the heavy bag. It became more than just a distraction. It became a release. Each strike, each kick, felt like he was forcing out the bitterness, the anger, the betrayal that had wrapped around his ribs like a vice. But it wasn't just his body that changed. Late at night, when the house was still and the ghosts of his past weren't quite so loud, Leonard found himself sketching again. Not corporate blueprints, not investor-driven designs. Just ideas. They started as idle lines on paper, aimless scribbles born out of restlessness. But as the days turned into weeks, those lines took shape. Concepts formed. Designs that had nothing to do with sterile office buildings or luxury apartments. Something different. Something alive. Community, self-sustaining, thriving on its own resources. A place where architecture wasn't just about efficiency, but about harmony with nature, with people, with the world itself. It was ambitious, probably even impossible. But for the first time in months, Leonard felt something stir inside him. Hope. He wasn't just escaping anymore. He was rebuilding. The weeks that followed were a carefully orchestrated symphony of patience, deception, and precision. Leonard had always been a strategist. Architecture had taught him that how to build something magnificent by first understanding every weakness, every flaw, and every possibility for collapse. This time, the structure he was preparing to dismantle wasn't made of steel and glass. It was Daniel Hart. While Leonard rebuilt himself, physically through Myra's training, mentally through the rekindling of his creative ambitions, he also built a case. A case against the man who had not only stolen his wife but had systematically climbed the corporate ladder by stepping on others. It started with a simple idea: information. He knew that Daniel wasn't just an ambitious young architect. He was an opportunist, one who had left a trail of wreckage behind him. He just had to find the right people who had been cast aside in Daniel's ascent. So Leonard reached out. Former colleagues, past partners, associates who had mysteriously left Vanguard Designs without explanation. Took time, but the pieces started falling into place. Patterns emerged. Daniel had a history of using personal relationships to his advantage, romantic or otherwise. A whispered conversation here, a stolen idea there. It wasn't just Helena. It had never just been Helena. Leonard compiled everything, documented every misstep, every manipulated deal, every incident where Daniel had taken credit for someone else's work. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't enough to expose him privately. Leonard needed an audience, and that's where Dubai came in. The International Architectural Summit was the perfect stage. Architects, investors, and industry titans from around the world would be in attendance. Vanguard Designs had already secured Daniel a keynote slot, where he would present their firm's latest skyscraper project. A project Leonard had originally been meant to lead, but Leonard had something better. A week before the summit, he sat across from Helena for the first time since their separation. She had reached out under the guise of closure, though he suspected she wanted to gauge where they stood. She looked tired, thinner than before, but her eyes still carried remnants of the woman who had once been his partner in everything. "Leonard," she began softly, stirring her untouched tea, "I want to say I'm sorry for everything." He nodded, allowing the words but not letting them sink in. "I told Daniel it's over," she continued. She swallowed. "I made a mistake." Leonard tilted his head. "Is that what it was?" She flinched. "I thought he cared about me, but he's not the person I thought he was." Leonard's lips curved slightly. "No, he isn't." Her gaze flickered up to his. "You already knew, didn't you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back, studying her. "You're coming to Dubai with him, aren't you?" She hesitated before nodding. "I don't know why. Maybe I just want to see how this all ends." Leonard smiled. "Then I suggest you get a front row seat." And just like that, the final piece was in place. Dubai was a spectacle of glass and ambition, its skyline a testament to what architecture could achieve. The summit was a convergence of visionaries, the best of the best. And at its center, standing on stage in the main hall, was Daniel Hart. Leonard watched from the back of the room as Daniel spoke with effortless charm, presenting the skyscraper project as if it were his life's work. His voice was smooth, his confidence unshaken. That wouldn't last. As Daniel wrapped up his presentation to polite applause, Leonard left the room. He had his own stage to claim. Auditorium B wasn't as grand, but it didn't need to be. Word had already spread. An unscheduled presentation, a name many had thought was on the decline. Curiosity was enough to fill the room. As Leonard stepped onto the stage, his hands were steady. The weight of the past months, of betrayal and loss, had hardened into something unbreakable. "I won't waste your time," he began, his voice even. "We've spent this summit talking about what's possible. But I'm here to talk about what's necessary." The screen behind him illuminated, revealing the blueprints of his newest design. The murmurs started immediately. A fully self-sustaining community. A blueprint that challenged the very fabric of urban development. Renewable energy sources seamlessly integrated, sustainable agriculture embedded within residential infrastructure. Waste reduced to near zero. It wasn't just a building. It was a revolution. As Leonard spoke, he saw it, the shift in the room, the slow realization of what they were witnessing. And then the doors at the back of the room opened. Daniel stepped in. His expression was unreadable at first, but as the details of Leonard's project sank in, his face darkened. Leonard barely acknowledged him. He was irrelevant now. By the time he finished, the room was electric. Questions flooded in. Investors wanted meetings. Executives wanted partnerships. And Daniel? He wanted to leave. But before he could slip away, Leonard's final move fell into place. Every industry leader's phone buzzed at once. A notification. A breaking article from a respected architecture publication. The headline? The cost of success. Inside Vanguard Design's culture of exploitation. The article exposed everything. Daniel's manipulations. His affairs with colleagues' spouses. His theft of ideas. Leonard stepped off the stage just as the whispers began to spread. Daniel turned toward him, rage simmering beneath the surface. You! Leonard smirked, adjusting his cufflinks. You should probably get ahead of that press storm. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. By the end of the day, Daniel Hart was finished. And Leonard Walsh? He had just built the future. The fallout from Dubai was swift and merciless. Within days, Daniel Hart was erased from the architectural world he had once dominated. His name, once synonymous with rising talent, became a stain on Vanguard Designs. Investors pulled out of projects he had been involved in, his connections severed one by one. Leonard watched from a distance, unmoved. The destruction had been inevitable, just a matter of time. His only focus now was moving forward. The self-sustaining community project had gained international traction, drawing interest from governments and private investors alike. His inbox overflowed with proposals, invitations to collaborate, offers that had once seemed unattainable. But before he could fully step into this new future, the past returned. A message from Helena arrived late one evening. Unlike her previous attempts at contact, this one was brief. No explanations, no apologies, just a request to meet. Leonard nearly ignored it, but something in his gut told him this wasn't just another plea for reconciliation. They met in a quiet cafe, the kind where no one asked questions and everyone minded their own business. She looked different, her features thinner, the light in her eyes dulled. She hesitated before revealing the reason she had called him here. She was pregnant. The air between them felt heavy, charged with implications neither had the energy to unpack. She had no certainty about the father. Leonard did the calculations in his head, but the numbers provided no clarity. A paternity test was arranged, and the days leading up to the results felt suspended in time. Leonard buried himself in work, preparing for his move to Singapore, finalizing project plans. The idea of being a father lingered at the edge of his thoughts, but he refused to entertain speculation. The results arrived. The doctor's voice was calm, professional. Leonard was not the father. Helena sat in silence, her expression unreadable. The weight of everything, the choices made, the damage done, settled over her. Outside the clinic, she barely met his eyes as she admitted she didn't know what to do next. Leonard reached into his pocket and handed her a lawyer's contact. Practicality was all he could offer now. She nodded, fingers tightening around the card. There were no final words, no desperate attempts to hold onto something that no longer existed. Leonard turned and walked away. A week later, he boarded a plane to Singapore. As the city lights receded below, the past became just another distant skyline, a landscape he had no intention of revisiting. His new life awaited, and for the first time it was entirely his own.